بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وافتح لنا فتوح العارفين آمين. Jazakumullah khair for joining us once again on another episode of Risalatul Mustarshideen. And we're just going to pick up from where we left off last week. And the author, he says, وَنَفَعَنَ اللَّهُ بِعُلُمِهِ فِي الدَّارَيْنِ آمين. May Allah enable us to benefit from His knowledge. وَكُلُّ أَمْرٍ لَا حَلَكَ ضَوْءُهُ بِمِنْهَاجِ الْحَقِّ فَعَرِضْهُ عَلَى الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ وَالْآدَابِ الصَّالِحَةِ. So the author, he says, and whenever any issue kind of arises in which there is some kind of ambiguity, or there is an issue that arises in which a person, which you do not have any knowledge on, then the author, he says, put it to and resort to and bring it up with what is mentioned in the Quran, Al-Kitab, wa Sunnah, and the prophetic tradition, and the righteous etiquettes. That's what the author says. So the righteous people and the etiquettes, these are the standard, or this is the criteria in which one uses whenever they want to gain new knowledge on any type of issue, especially something that they did not have any prior knowledge of. And something which is a very important method of adopting, because then a person will always be in a safe place, learning and knowing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from them. And actually, I wanted to mention a beautiful tradition by Al-Junayd. Al-Junayd was one of the early Imams of Islamic spirituality, Al-Junayd, and he said, alayhi rahmatullah, he said, مَذْهَبُنَا هَذَا مُقَيَّدٌ بِالْأُصُولِ. So those, they say, is this tradition of ours, so he's talking about Islamic spirituality, and he says this spiritual path that we have, and this this method that we have regarding our tradition, he says it's muqayyadun bil usul. He says it's constrained with certain principles. So it's a principled a tradition, and he says it's principled by the book, meaning the divine revelation of Quran, or Sunnah, the prophetic tradition. And then he said, فَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْفَظِ الْكِتَابِ. Anybody who doesn't memorize and have knowledge of Quran, وَيَكْتُبُ الْحَدِيث, and anybody who doesn't write down the hadith, meaning they have no tradition, hadith traditional understanding of the prophetic tradition, وَيَتَفَقَّهُ, and anyone who hasn't learned Islamic jurisprudence. And fiqh over here is referring to ma'rifatul halal wal haram, meaning having knowledge of what's permissible and what's not permissible. The author, he mentions, he says, La yuqtada bihi. This is a person who can never truly be followed. Meaning this is a person who, whatever they call themselves, they won't really be able to be benefited from, simply because their method is not the one that we've described here. So anybody who doesn't use as their standard criteria the Quran, the Hadith, prophetic tradition, and Islamic fiqh jurisprudence, having that ma'rifah and that knowledge of how to deduce rulings. So what does this mean in Quran and Sunnah? Because obviously a person isn't allowed to just take from the Quran and Sunnah as they please, or as how they interpret it to be. But how is it interpreted by the classical scholarly figures in our tradition? So that's what fiqh means. So fiqh means having that interpretation and knowing then what the rulings are regarding these issues. If a person doesn't know any of these things, the Imam al-Junayd says la yuqtada bihi, which means he is not really taken into consideration, this person. And this is mentioned in many different books. So it's something which is very interesting, and it's something really important. And then the author says, فَإِنْ خَفِيَ عَلَيْكَ أَمْرٌ. Whenever there's an issue that you don't really, that's kind of hidden, a person really doesn't know, and you can't really find any reputable Islamic opinion on the issue, meaning you can't really, and obviously you have to realize in this section he's talking to scholarly people, he's not talking to the layperson. So people like us, he's not this is not who he's talking to. He's speaking to people who are scholarly. So he's saying to a person who's studying the knowledge and the Islamic science, he's saying if there's an issue that you cannot find, you're studying, and you're somebody you're somebody who's scholarly and you don't know a certain issue, then فَخُذْ فِيهِ رَأْيَ مَنْ تَرَضَى دِينَهُ وَعَقْلَهُ. The author says, then take the opinion of somebody whom you are pleased with in their religion and in their intellect. So somebody who you trust. So this is an example of whenever you don't have an understanding of any certain issue or anything like that, then take the opinion of somebody whom you trust. So for example, the four madhabs. These are established schools of Islamic jurisprudence, and they have been recognized by all of the scholars who came after them. So the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, these are recognized schools of Islamic law, and they're recognized Islamic traditions, and the whole Muslim world has all agreed upon, unanimously, that these are schools that are considered to be valid. The author, he says, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ عَلَى الْحَقِّ شَاهِدًا بِقَبُولِ النَّفْسِ لَهُ. So the author says, and know that the truth has a witness because of the fact, and that witness that he's referring to is بِقَبُولِ النَّفْسِ لَهُ, is the acceptance and the natural inclination that the soul has towards any given issue. So can, for example, can an individual ever reach the truth simply by having a certain feeling in their heart towards that issue or that thing? Well, many scholars, they say that really, truth, sometimes they say truth can be known, depending on what we're talking about, truth can be known simply through the feeling of your heart towards that issue. So that's why the Prophet, he said one day, أَلَا تَرَى, in the author he says, أَلَا تَرَى لِقَوْلِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ, do you not then consider the statement by the Prophet ﷺ when he said, استفتي قلبك وإن أفتاك المفتون. The author, he says, al-muftun. So the author, he says, also inquire your heart, he said, alayhi salatu wasalam. Somebody came to him asking a question, and the Prophet said, istafti qalbak, what does your heart tell you? So there are certain times where we know what something is right to be right and something is wrong to be wrong. We don't really necessarily sometimes require our hearts are capable of understanding, and that's how Allah created it. This is what we call the fitrah. فطرة الله التي, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, فطر الناس عليها, the fitrah and the natural disposition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for the human being. Allah created every single one of us upon a fitrah, upon a natural disposition in which we are able to somewhat maneuver and understand what is right and what is wrong. The Sharia and the revelation complements that which we already know. And I don't want to really get into the debate. Many of the Islamic theologians of the past, they had a discussion as to whether good and evil can only be understood through revelation, and whether they can be understood through the natural disposition and the intellect. So that's a whole new other discussion I don't want to really get into. Either way, the Prophet ﷺ, he said in this hadith, istafti qalbak, meaning he said, what does your heart tell you? So it kind of does show us that sometimes we kind of deeply do understand when something is wrong, and this usually happens when a person is uncomfortable. When a person is extremely uncomfortable with doing something, then this is an indication that this person knows that this is wrong. And it's quite interesting because when the Prophet said in an exact similar hadith, that a person knows they're doing something right simply by having tuma'nina, by simply having some level of tranquility and comfort in their hearts. Whereas if there's taraddud, meaning if there's back and forth and there's a level of discomfort and a person is very apprehensive despite doing whatever it is that they're doing, then that's an indication that what they're doing is incorrect and something which is not Islamically valid. The author then he says, وَقَيِّدِ الْجَوَارِحَ بِإِحْكَامِ الْعِلْمِ. So the author he says, tie your limbs meaning restrict, okay, your limbs by implementation of knowledge, okay, and by the establishment of knowledge. So knowledge is what really can give us the perspective of being able to understand what we should be doing, what we should not be doing. That is what we should hold us back. If we're held back from anything, it should be through knowledge. And if we want to go and do something, it should be through knowledge. It should be by knowing exactly what is this halal, what I'm about to do? Is it impermissible? It's something which is very important. The author is saying, let your limbs be restricted by knowledge. So knowledge of what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, let that be the restriction that's established by knowledge. Let knowledge be the factor, and let knowledge be the main criteria. Let knowledge be the standard, okay, in which we use in what we want to do and what we don't want to do. Because then at least we know that if we're going to do something, we at least know it's Islamically permissible. If we're not going to do something, then we know that there's either disliked or it's either impermissible. Okay, so that's something which is very important. If we have this mindset and we kind of implement this, then really a lot of things will change in our daily lives. We'd be able to kind of become much closer to Allah. We'd have a much better relationship, something which is we'll be able to come and be a better version of ourselves. The author then he says, وَرَاعِ هَمَّكَ بِمَعْرِفَةِ قُرْبِ اللَّهِ مِنْكَ. So the author he says, take yourselves to account and always monitor yourself and your situation and yourselves by having knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always near to you. So having that knowledge that Allah is always watching me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always nearby. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows exactly what I'm doing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware and fully informed of everything that's going on, kind of gives us a new way of looking at things. It means that you're not going to really do, if a person really internalizes this belief, then what it means is, when I say, I mean this belief that we're talking about here, a person internalizes it, it means that then everything that they do is on the is on the backdrop of having that knowledge. So that knowledge, it facilitates everything that you do. It kind of provides you everything that you kind of need to know in every situation that you're about to do. So it's something which is very important. Having that level of consciousness isn't very easy. It requires a lot of piety, it requires a lot of good deeds. It requires abstainment from sin. It requires doing that which Allah is pleased with. So there's so much that goes along with it. It's not something very, it's not something, very, you don't just get it free of charge. It's something that a person needs to work towards. The author, he says, وَقُمْ بَيْنَ يَدَيْهِ مَقَامَ الْعَبْدِ الْمُسْتَجِيرِ. So the author, he says, and stand before Allah like a servant who's in great need. Okay. If you do that, the author says, تَجِدْهُ رَؤُوفًا رَحِيمًا. You will find Allah to be extremely kind, extremely merciful. So if you stand before Allah, in acknowledgement of your sin and in acknowledgement of your atonement to that sin by seeking Allah's forgiveness, and you stand in front of Allah as a person who is desperately in need for His kindness and for His mercy, then the author, he says, you will find Him to be that towards you. If you recognize this in Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will show you what you recognize. تَجِدُهُ رَؤُوفًا رَحِيمًا. You will find Him to be very kind and very merciful. So it's something which is very interesting. Many a times we grow up having a negative image of, and I'll tell you what that means. What does it mean? What does it mean to say having a negative image of Allah? Always assuming that every mistake you do will be accompanied by Allah's anger and Allah's wrath and Allah's punishment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَيَعْفُوا عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. Allah forgives much, He forgives. Meaning even those issues in which a person deserves some accountability, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala overlooks much. And that's an encouragement for the person to turn back to Allah. So it's something which is very important then for us to understand, that we need to kind of reset this mindset and rewire our minds and our feelings and our understanding to one in which, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't always necessarily want to punish. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also very forgiving and very merciful, and striking that balance is very important. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, مَا يَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ بِعَذَابِكُمْ إِن شَكَرْتُمْ وَآمَنْتُمْ. Allah, He says, What benefit is it for Allah to punish you if you show great gratitude and you have belief? If you have belief and you're grateful to Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, what need or what would it benefit me to punish you? What would I gain from punishing you? If you are grateful and you have iman, Allah says this in the Quran, مَا يَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ بِعَذَابِكُمْ إِن شَكَرْتُمْ وَآمَنْتُمْ. What would it benefit me in punishing you if you have iman and you're grateful to Allah? So then you will find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be very kind, and you'll find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be extremely merciful. And that's something which is an encouragement to many of us, okay, who may be slack in or slack in, trying to re-establish a good position with Allah. So the author says, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So he's quoting the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. The author says, إن الله عز وجل, indeed God Almighty, ينزل العبد من نفسه بقدر منزلته منه. So the author says, indeed God Almighty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives a position to the servant in relation to the position that the servant gives to Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks to you in the way that you look towards Him. So if you have a very, very, very high opinion about Allah, a very, very good opinion about Allah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a very good opinion about you. If you give Allah due consideration and everything you do is for Allah and you put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above everything else, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will likewise put you above everything else. That's how it works. And Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, he mentions about this hadith, he says, هو جزء من حديث ورد في فضل ذكر الله عز وجل بنحو هذا اللفظ. So the author, he says that this hadith is a part of another hadith that speaks about the virtues of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you find it in different books like At-Targhib wa Tarhib, and many of the narrators of the hadith are considered to be considered to be sound and trustworthy. The author says, وَذَلِكَ عَلَى قَدْرِ الْخَشْيَةِ لِلَّهِ. And he goes, all of this, the author, he says, is dependent on the level of fear of Allah that exists, وَالْعِلْمِ بِهِ, and knowledge of Him, وَالْمَعْرِفَةِ لَهُ, and coming to an understanding. So al-ilm and al-ma'rifah, some of the scholars, they say it means the same thing. So al-ilm and al-ma'rifah. And some, they say actually doesn't mean, it means two different things. An example of a difference in meaning would be al-ilm referring to having knowledge of something, and the essence of that knowledge is true. So meaning you have a knowledge of something, and what you have a knowledge of is actually the way and the exact reality of what you think that is. Or that which you have knowledge of is in its reality exactly reflective of your knowledge of that thing, as opposed to ma'rifah. Ma'rifah is an understanding and also a type of knowledge, but it doesn't necessitate anything to do with the world of reality. With the world of realities, you can have a ma'rifah or knowledge of something, and it could be wrong. So that's some of the examples or the differences that are given by some of the scholars in usul. The author then, he says, so this is all dependent really on the position you have with Allah is all dependent on the level of fear that you have of Allah, the amount of knowledge and understanding that you have of Allah. These are all dependent. So how much knowledge do you have of Allah? How much understanding do you have of Allah? How much fear do you have of Allah? Because these are all the factors that are taken into consideration in establishing the position that you have with Allah. So it's very important then for a person to have fear of Allah, to have knowledge of Allah, and to have understanding of Allah. If you have these, then it means that you will be in a higher position with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The author then, he says, وَعَلَمْ أَنَّهُ مَنْ آثَرَ اللَّهَ آثَرَهُ. The author says, then know that anybody who gives preference to Allah, Allah gives that person preference. Okay? I'll mention that again. Anybody who gives preference to Allah, Allah gives preference to that person. What does this mean? Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, he mentions and he says, it means من قدم طاعة الله على حظ نفسه واختصه الله بالقرب منه والرضا عنه. So he says, anybody who gives precedence to the obedience of Allah, it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them that preferential treatment and that preferential position. وَمَنْ أَطَاعَهُ فَقَدْ أَحَبَّهُ. And the one who obeys Allah, indeed Allah loves that person. That's what the author is saying. وَمَنْ أَطَاعَهُ فَقَدْ أَحَبَّهُ. The one who obeys his Lord or her Lord, Allah loves that person. وَمَنْ تَرَكَ لَهُ شَيْئًا لَمْ يُعَذِّبْهُ بِهِ. And anybody who leaves something off for his sake, he or she will not be held accountable for that thing. So you have something, say for example, somebody does a sin. Any of us, we commit sins. May Allah forgive all of us. Say for example, you've committed a sin, but you abandoned it for his sake. You've stopped it for his sake. You will never be held. The author is saying you will never be held accountable for that. وَمَنْ تَرَكَ لَهُ شَيْئًا. Anybody who leaves a sin for Allah, he or she will never be held accountable for that. كما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The author says, as was mentioned by the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, دع ما يريبك إلى ما لا يريبك. The author says, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, دع ما يريبك إلى ما لا يريبك. Leave that which causes that which doesn't cause you any doubt. And what does this mean exactly? It means leave that which causes you any doubt for that which doesn't cause you doubt, meaning anything regarding the halal and the haram. If there's something that causes you doubt, is this permissible, is it not permissible? If you leave it, then that's something which is superior, and you will be rewarded simply for being somebody who was careful in consideration, and you will be rewarded for that. So the Prophet he says, leave that which causes you doubt for that which doesn't cause you doubt. Let your life be embodied by things which are of no doubt whatsoever. So never put yourself in a compromising position. The author says, فَإِنَّكَ لَن تَجِدَ فَقْدَ شَيْءٍ تَرَكْتَهُ لِلَّهِ. So the author over here, he mentions, and he says, and it's from the hadith actually of that was narrated by Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, فإنك لن تجد فقد شيء تركته لله فهي زلة غيرتها فلذلك جعلته خارج. The author he says, so basically the author he's saying over here, never anything that you leave, if you find something, فإنك لن تجد فقد شيء, anything that is removed or doesn't exist anymore that you've left for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you will find it as a reward. That's something very important for you to understand. So anything that you've done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, and that you've left it for Him, you did something for Allah's sake, and you left something sinful for His sake, that means you will be rewarded for that thing that you've done, and you will not be held accountable for that thing that you've left. The author then he says, وَحْمِلْ قَلْبَ عَنْ سُوءِ الظَّنِّ بِحُسْنِ التَّأْوِيلِ. The author he says, cleanse the heart, or take care of the heart, or remove from the heart any negative opinion that you may have, بِحُسْنِ التَّأْوِيلِ, by giving it a good interpretation. Anytime your suspicions are raised about anybody because of something that's happened, then what you do, and your job is interpretation. So you kind of find an excuse and you say, but perhaps maybe it was this. And you say, oh, but it could be because of this. You see somebody doing something questionable, oh, maybe because of this. You see somebody doing something absolutely wrong in your eyes, completely, right in front of you, maybe it's because this and that exists. Maybe there are circumstances. Maybe these circumstances is what caused them to do this and that and all of that. Just make an excuse for people. We will never be from the righteous people unless we implement this. Because nowadays we live in a society in which we always want to show people off. We want to always embarrass people. We want to always be so judgmental of what people are doing. So it's really interesting, and it's really the times we're living in. It kind of just shows you the level of it kind of shows you the level of disdain that we have for for each other. So the author is saying here that should, our primary responsibility is that even if somebody is doing something absolutely something wrong, completely wrong, we try and find a good interpretation for it. The author says, وَحْمِلْ قَلْبَ, do not let your heart even entertain the idea that this person, any bad thoughts about this person. And how do you do that? The author says by giving good interpretation. وَحْمِلْ قَلْبَ عَنْ سُوءِ الظَّنِّ بِحُسْنِ تَأْوِيلٍ. You give a good interpretation for their actions or for their words or whatever the case may be. Even if you don't find any excuse for this person, so and so is going through a lot. And may Allah bless them. They've been patient for a long time, and and may Allah, you say good words. And this is only for the ones who want to be, wants to reach the highest levels, because it's easy to backbite and slander and talk ill of. That's the easy thing to do, especially when you don't have a inclination or any liking towards the person. But if your heart's in the right place and you want to be from the righteous, then in those circumstances you don't say anything bad and you don't say anything negative, and in fact you do the opposite. The author then he says, وَادْفَعِ الْحَسَدِ بِقَصْرِ الْأَمَلِ. The author he says, and remove envy from your heart by not having much hope, meaning not having much expectations. So the reason why envy is something real is because we have too much expectations of certain things. Maybe if we lowered that expectations, we wouldn't have that much that much envy residing in our hearts. And this is one thing that we need to do. So implementing these things are very, very important. So what we should do is we should not have much expectations. Everybody has their mistakes. Everybody is going through difficulty and going through trial and tribulation. No, just because you see somebody who you assume is doing well and you assume is doing much better than you, that's not necessarily the case. You don't truly know that that's the reality. You don't know what they're going through. So don't do something because you don't know. وَانْفِي الْكِبْرَ. The author says, and remove arrogance. That's something which is very important. Okay. So this is something which is extreme. وَانْفِي الْكِبْرَ. How do you do that? How do you remove? The author says, بِاسْتِبْطَانِ الْعِزِّ. By covering, okay, and making only inward that level of pride that a person has, something which is very important. So it's something that the author is talking about suppression over here. So suppressing, okay, feelings of pride, feelings of arrogance is a way we can deal with it. So that's something which is very, very important. And there's much that the author can say, inshallah, but we leave it here, inshallah, and we will continue this next week, inshallah. Bi-idhnillah, inshallah, there's much that can be said, inshallah, of this section, inshallah, and we will begin from the beginning of the section, inshallah, and we will continue like that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continuously bless all of us, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to purify our hearts. Ameen. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.